And this is a course I teach. It takes 6 weeks. We study a number of the famous trials that changed the world. The point of this for my law students is to look at the importance of due process. So that's a temporal legal thing. But this bleeds over into our faith as well. And it's fascinating that John was talking about the curse tablet. Is that what you called it? Okay. Well, one of the things we're going to talk about today is the requirements of Jewish law. Christ is going to be convicted of blasphemy, but we're going to see that blasphemy required the use of God's name in a curse of God himself. And that was the only thing that was punishable as blasphemy under Jewish law. The only thing. So remember that as we go through and see whether or not the evidence that the Jews put forth against Christ will meet that. So we're going to start with the 4 major characters who are going to be 4 judges, and the 4 judges in these 6 trials. 2 of them are going to be before Pilate. We're going to look at the historical context. Oliver Wendell Holmes said a very famous quote that I use every day in my classes, that a page of history is worth a volume of logic in understanding the law. And that's certainly true in Christ's trial. Then we're going to look at the temple conspiracies, the deep state conspiracy to get Christ and what motivated it and how they were carried out. And we don't have time. I teach more than 12 in the class that we parse through. We're just going to look at 2 of the more famous ones today so that you can see that this was a very calculated campaign that different Jewish groups conspired together to get Christ, and we'll look at the motives for that. Then we'll take a look at Jewish law and criminal procedure. And one of the things that's really fascinating about this is that the Jewish law and protections of the innocent are, in the history of the world, the greatest that have ever been achieved. And we're looking now at 22 centuries before current-day United States. But the United States, even with very liberal interpretations of our Bill of Rights and the protections that we give defendants in our criminal cases, do not come close to the protections that were given under Jewish law. So how is it, if Jewish law was so wonderful and protected innocent defendants, and Christ is the most innocent defendant in the history of the world, how was he convicted? Well, the reason is going to be that the Jewish officials ignored these legal provisions. And I just have to comment, this is exactly what Roman officials did at the end of the Republic of Rome. And if you know much about the story of the Republic of Rome, you can look at our own society today and you'll see exactly the same things happening that happened there, which is the primary reason I left practical law to become a college professor. Then we're going to take a look. I am very sympathetic compared to many people after going through these trial records to what Pilate did. And what I want to do is I want to present Pilate to you and ask you to put yourself in his position. And what I'm going to actually show you is that Pilate is going to risk his neck and go out 4 times. He's going to try to get 4 different techniques to spare Christ from being executed wrongfully. He often doesn't get credit for that. Of course, in the end, he does buckle. And then we'll take a look at what happened to these 4 major characters at the end. So what I want to do begin, Annas, Caiaphas, Pilate, and Herod Antipas. You've probably heard their names if you read through Scripture, but I want to give you a little bit of their background. Annas was a former high priest, and the high priests at this time were not the legitimate high priests as required by Old Testament law, but they were appointed as political puppets by the Romans. And Annas was appointed, and he held this position, but something that's going to be very important for us is that he lost his position. He was fired by the Romans, and the reason that he was fired is going to really impact our story today is because he condemned a man to death, but then had him executed without going to the Roman procurator and getting Rome's permission. So what we're going to see is that the Jews are going to go back not once but twice to Pilate to try to get Pilate's permission to execute Christ. That's the reason Pilate comes in, because the high priest Caiaphas doesn't want to lose his job the way that Annas lost his. Now, Annas is really a notorious figure. He is very much a religious godfather. The secular leaders are scared of him. He reports to Rome, as Herod Antipas will do, and he also is the man who runs all of the markets and the money-changing tables in the temple. So if you, to kind of flesh that out for you, all the Jews at Passover were required to come and execute, sacrifice an animal. But you had to buy the animals in the temple complex. But before you could buy those animals, you had to change your money into temple money. And I don't know if y'all have ever gone to Mexico or some foreign country, but it's amazing how the rate differs between what the dollar's worth here and what it's worth in a changing house. And so what happened is the money lenders would take advantage often of the poorest people in Israel who are there for the holiest of reasons to make profit. And that profit went directly to Annas. And Annas behind the scenes was the godfather of the temple. Now, he was a Sadducee, and the two groups in the Sanhedrin are going to be the Sadducees and Pharisees. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the Sadducees only believed that the first 5 books of the Bible were legitimate, the Torah, and they rejected any ideas that were not contained in there. So they reject the idea of eternal life. They reject the idea of a Messiah. And that influences his attitudes towards Christ because he's going to see Christ as a false prophet. In addition to that, Christ is a pain in his side because Christ cleanses the temple not once but twice and gives a justification to the people so that the people realize that basically it is a den of thieves instead of a house of prayer. So he is going to be very, very active in trying to get rid of Christ, and the conspiracies are going to intensify once Lazarus is raised from the dead. Now the second figure, so Annas will be the judge in the first, what we call the first trial of Christ. Now these are, I call them 6 trials because they're really interrogations. All 6 of them happen in one morning. Okay, Christ is going to be arrested in the garden after midnight, probably around 3 or 4 a.m., and he'll be on the cross by noon of that same day. So all of these different trials are going to take place very, very quickly. So Christ will be interrogated by Annas, and he'll be sent across a courtyard to the house of Caiaphas. Caiaphas is the sitting high priest at the time, and he's also Annas' son-in-law. Caiaphas is also a Sadducee, just like Annas was, and he's going to be the presiding officer at the trial, the second trial, and the third trial before the Sanhedrin. Our third character, Pilate. Pilate's a very interesting character. He married the illegitimate stepdaughter of Caesar Tiberius, and that's how he gets his position as a wedding gift. His wife, Claudia, was very superstitious in religion, and you remember the story. She has a dream and comes to Pilate, telling Pilate not to let anything bad happen to Christ. But she was given the great privilege of being with Pilate when he was sent out to his position in Judea. That was a privilege that was rarely afforded. But the reason for this is that the man who was actually ruling Rome at the time, the primary counselor for Tiberius, a man named Sejanus, was a very close friend of hers. So Sejanus gives Pilate the appointment. Now Pilate has no political experience before he gets this job. And as I'll explain to you, he's going to step in it 3 times, big times, that are going to have very negative political problems for him, all of which are going to influence the trials of Christ. We call these the 3 incidents, the 3 Jewish incidents that Pilate has. He is a brutal man. He's a military man. The position that he holds in Judea gives him exactly the same authority that a Roman officer had over their soldiers in combat. So he has literal life and death powers over every, and the final say in every civil and military decision that gets made. And then lastly, Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas is the heir to Herod the Great. Herod the Great is one of the great monsters. I'm not going to go into it now because this is a polite group, but when you get home, if you want to see what Herod was like, just Google the deed of Herod, and you'll see what kind of a person he was. Josephus says that Herod was so evil that he was punished with the sin unto death, and the sin unto death is secretly adapted by trial lawyers in Houston as a curse that we give to our opponents the night before the trial begins. So but you can get Josephus and have that. So he famously is going to have John the Baptist beheaded. And if you know the story of Salome, Salome's name never appears in Scripture, but it does appear in Josephus's works. But Herod divorces his wife to marry his brother's widow. Unfortunately, the brother's widow is married to another guy, so she divorces him as well. And her name, which is easy for me to remember, is Herodias. So Herod and Herodias get married, and many people felt that this was incestuous because she was the former wife of Herod's half-brother. But John the Baptist would be there at every public appearance, standing there next to the red carpet, pointing his finger and pointing out that this was sin, that they were married this way. So when, you know, the famous story, the dance of Salome, where she dances at Herod's birthday party. He is both drunk and probably aroused and stands up and stupidly says, "I'll give you anything you want, up to half my kingdom." In his culture, since he said that in front of all of his nobles, he has to keep the promise. So Salome goes to her mother Herodias and says, "What should I ask for, Mama?" And she says, "The head of John the Baptist on a platter." And then they bring the head in at the birthday party. Now, I've had a lot of birthday parties in my life up till now, and some of them have been pretty good, but I think that would really be a downer to any kind of a birthday party. So when Christ appears, Herod is going to be afraid that Christ is the reincarnated John the Baptist. And so that's going to be the fifth trial that Christ has, and the sixth trial would be back in front of Pilate. So the Great Sanhedrin is the highest court of the Jews. This is going to be very, very important for what happens today. And it's going to conduct Christ's third trial. It is primarily of these two different religious groups, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Sadducees will generally have the chief priest, and the associate chief priest will be Sadducees. They are the older people who value wealth and power above anything else. They are the people who have collaborated with Rome, and we'll talk about them a little bit more in a second. The Pharisees are a very legalistic sect. So historians talk about the bruised and bleeding Pharisees. They would make a big show of their righteousness. And so some of these Pharisees, because they didn't want to look at women and be tempted into lust by looking at women, they would actually wear cloth over themselves, and they would fall down or walk into buildings. And so these were known as the bruised and bleeding Pharisees. So the Sadducees are going to be upset with Christ because Christ is going to be a threat to their power and their wealth. The Romans put these people in power to keep peace, and they're afraid that Christ is going to lead a revolt and they'll lose their position. The Pharisees are going to be very upset because the Pharisees are very popular with the people because of their righteousness. They see Rome as a punishment from God, and their belief and their program is to get the Jews back to observing closely the Mosaic law, and once they do that, then God will cleanse Israel of the Romans. They're popular with the people because they refuse to collaborate. But these two groups, theologically, are very much opposed to each other. Politically, they're very much opposed to each other, but they're going to join together in their attempt to kill Christ. Now, the historical context, in 6 AD, Rome takes direct control, something that is not really appreciated, but Rome was in a Cold War at this time with an empire that was kind of the revised Persian Empire called the Parthian Empire. And the Judea is right in the middle. I mean, it's God's most strategic location throughout human history. But Rome and Parthia both think that they're going to have a huge war with each other. And so the people in Rome, which is currently under Roman control, are there to maintain Roman control, but the Parthians have been successful in the past in having civil war and getting control of the area as well. So this is kind of a buffer state in this kind of Cold War between Rome and Parthia, and Rome then makes the decision in 6 AD that they want to take direct control because they think a war with Parthia is going to be very, very imminent. Then in 26 AD, Pontius Pilate will come and become prefect of Judea. Christ begins his ministry around 29 AD. It's going to last for about 3.5 years. And then in 29 AD, Herod Antipas is going to prison and behead John the Baptist. So that gives us the historical setting. I'm a great fan of the wonderful Renaissance painter Caravaggio. Caravaggio, by the way, murdered at least 3 people. But because he was such a good painter, he managed to get out of jail. Okay, that was an Italian Renaissance for you. But here's one of the paintings of beheading John the Baptist, and then here's the picture of the head of John the Baptist on a platter. So what I want you to understand is these are very brutal times, very brutal times. And I want you to understand that because the contrast between the times and the behavior of the rulers in this area with Jewish law is startling. It's just startling. Now, I told you that Pilate had these 3 incidents. I want to tell you about this because I want you to understand that every group that Pilate had to deal with had been dreadfully antagonized by Pilate before Christ shows up. And Pilate is going to be acting at all times trying to keep his job. And I often say that the trials before Pilate is not about Christ's the power of Christ's truth. It's about, for Pilate, the truth of keeping his power. So how did he get into such a tenuous relationship? Well, Josephus tells us two of these incidents, and then a Jewish historian named Philo of Alexandria gives us a third one. But when Pilate comes in 27 AD, he puts up images of Tiberius Caesar. And you know the Ten Commandments strictly forbids any images of people or any natural thing being put up. And there's a fortress right next to the Temple Mount called the Antonia Fortress, named after Mark Antony. And the fortress is higher than the Temple Mount. And these images are all around there so that everybody that goes into the temple has to look up at all of these graven images. And not only graven images, but graven images of the man who has come and conquered their country, who they want. So imagine you're Pilate. All of a sudden he looks out one day, and all around him, Jews have just laid down on the ground. And they stay there 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. He can't get them to leave. So after the 5th day, he sends his soldiers out. And they say, you Jews, if you don't get up and leave now, we're going to kill you. And the Jews do something extraordinary. Each one of them takes their clothes and does this. This was the gesture that Roman gladiators made when they knew that they were about to die, to show that they were not afraid to die in Roman culture. So they exposed their necks so that they could be easily killed. So this was the gesture that they made. And Pilate didn't know what to do. He decides, I can't kill them all. So he backs off and takes down the images of Caesar. But by the time this is over, he has greatly alienated himself from the Jews, and these are the people he's trying to control. The second incident is the Aqueduct Riot. And the Romans incredible aqueducts. If you get to go to Israel, in the north near Caesarea, there's an aqueduct that was built roughly at this time, and it was used for the main water supply in the country up until about 150 years ago. But the aqueduct is still completely intact there. The amazing thing about the Roman engineering is that they didn't use any mortar in these things, and they still stand for over 1,000 years. So Israel, of course, is a parched land, and so Pilate decides he'll curry favor with the Jews by building an aqueduct and giving them a permanent water supply. But he needs money, so he goes and he foolishly takes it from the temple treasury. Well, to the Jews, that's not man's money. Roman Gentiles are not allowed to enter in there, and when they come in and then take the money, and the Jews find out about it, then there's protests and a riot, and the Jews are hurling insults, not unlike the Boston Massacre in our own history. And then what happens is Pilate says, go ahead and use force to restore order. And so many Jews are killed. But what happens is the Jews that are killed are not really the Jews that were protesting. They were other Jews who had come down from Galilee in order to make their sacrifices at Passover. Now, Galilee is ruled by Herod Antipas. And so this event then antagonizes Herod Antipas greatly, and that's going to create more problems for Pilate. Then the third incident we get from Philo of Alexandria. Remember the fortress that I had? Pilate, for some reason, puts gilded shields around that fortress, and the gilded shields say to the divine Caesar Tiberius, which is also viewed as idolatry by the Jews. And so when the Jews go to temple, they look up, and if you know the dome of the rock has a gold dome, and in the morning at dawn and at sunset, that dome you can see for many, many miles. So every time the Jews go there, this gold is reflecting the light down on them and illuminating this hated symbol, not only their conquest, but also a violation of their Jewish law. And so they then go to Pilate and try to get him to take him down, and he won't do it, so they then appeal directly to Caesar, and Caesar himself orders Pilate to take these down. So now he has antagonized Caesar, so Pilate is on thin ice with everybody in his environment. So that's going to influence what he does. Now the temple conspiracies, if you go and tell, there's a wonderful Jewish museum. I'll show you some other pictures of artifacts from there. But y'all would actually love getting to go there. And this is a model that this would come up to about to my shoulders of the city of Jerusalem at the time that Christ lived. And it was originally built by a hotel to get American tourists to come to stay in that hotel. But the museum took it over, and it's really a wonderful thing. And it shows a very good idea, and we're going to be talking about where the Sanhedrin meets. And the Sanhedrin is going to meet in a room that is right behind here. And so that's where the third of Christ's trials is going to take place. Now, the temple conspiracies are going to have basically three groups: the Pharisees, who we've talked about, and the Sadducees, who we've talked about, and their motives. And then the third one is going to be the Herodians. And the Herodians are just the political entourage of Herod Antipas. But Herod Antipas holds his position too at the pleasure of the Romans, and he needs to keep order as well. So these three groups all see Christ as a threat to their power and their position or their status in society. And as often happens throughout history, this is going to be a form of what we call a judicial murder. And all through history, politicians have tried to cloak their attempt to murder or assassinate someone with legal process to make it more tenable. And so these are going to be a series of show trials. So what they're going to try to do, they're very clever. They have great legal advice to try to trap Christ into committing a crime. And the two things in which they're going to try to entrap him are going to be blasphemy under Jewish law or treason under Roman law. So I want to go just really quickly. This is one of your tables that you have in your handout if you want to look at it later. But basically I want to look at the beliefs and the attitudes of these folks and how they differ from each other. So one way to remember Sadducees that I tell my kids, my wife told me one time that they don't believe in eternal life, they don't believe in angels, and they are sad, you see, okay? I know, pun. Everybody hates puns, but I love them, it's my curse. So they follow only the written Torah, no oral tradition at all, no Messiah, no life after death, okay? Now, opposed to them are going to be the Pharisees. And the Pharisees are going to go way beyond the Torah, and books that are historical books or books of the prophets, they're going to recognize as legitimate, but they are also going to have a very strong oral tradition. Unlike the Sadducees, the Pharisees believe in immortality, they believe in Messiah, and they believe in a system of works that if they are just moral enough, then God will free their country from the Romans. Now, the attitude to Rome from the Sadducees is one of complete cooperation. They see Rome as the big gravy train, and they hold positions to accomplish Roman policy. And the chief priest is actually loyal to Rome and not really loyal to Judaism. And when Herod rebuilt the temple, by the way, there was a big fight because he put a Roman, I'll show you a picture of one, a Roman eagle above the entrance to the temple. Imagine if you're an Orthodox Jew and you see that in your holiest place. Now, the attitude towards Rome of the Pharisees, however, is that they are a punishment from God because the people have not followed the Mosaic law, and they will not cooperate with Rome at all. As a consequence of these attitudes, the Sadducees are extremely unpopular with the common people, and the Pharisees are very popular. But their attitudes towards Christ are going to be the same. Both of them are going to see Christ as a threat. The Sadducees, many people, they see that people around them, many Jews are being persuaded to believe that Christ is the Messiah, and they're afraid then that, according to some of the beliefs of the day, that they believe that Christ will lead a military revolt, and that this will cost the Sadducees their power in the temple and their wealth. And then the Pharisees, if you remember in the Gospels, Christ has the 7 woes to the Pharisees, where he criticizes the Pharisees primarily for their hypocrisy. And for the first time, the Pharisees have their position in society as the holiest people challenged, and they're actually exposed like whitewashed tombstones. So Christ is a threat to their social status. For the Sadducees, Christ is a threat to wealth and power. And this is going to bring these two groups that can't stand each other together in their conspiracy. So 6 days before Passover, we have the famous meeting that Caiaphas is conducting. He's the current chief priest. And this is what he says: if we let Christ go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place, that should be an and our nation. So Caiaphas then is worried that because the diaspora of the Jews have come to Jerusalem from all over the world, after Lazarus has been raised from the dead, he's afraid that the Jews will believe in Christ and then go and spread that news throughout all the Jewish world as well. But he's also afraid that they will provoke such unrest in Israel that he will lose his position. So, one of the great ironies of the Bible, Caiaphas justified killing Jesus by saying it is expedient for you that one man die for the people rather than the whole nation perish. And of course, the irony of this is that one man will die for the people so that the people will not perish, but the death that matters is the spiritual death and the spiritual life of the people and not the physical. So, you may have heard the story. This is one of my two favorite stories. I always tell my law students, Jesus would have been a great law partner. He is so brilliant in how he disarms these traps that they have. But I want to show you this. We'll come back to the slide in a second. This is the what's called the tribute penny or the denarius, and this is the coin that's going to be used in the story I'm going to tell you right here. And here's a picture on this side. That's Tiberius's face. On this side is his mother, who is shown as the chief high priestess. So in this one of the conspiracies that takes place 3 days before Passover, the Pharisees and the Herodians get together and they think they come up with an ideal trap for Christ. So they're going to ask him a question, and of course Christ is surrounded by people, and so it's a public questioning. And they say, Christ, tell us, Rabbi, is it lawful under the Torah to pay taxes to Caesar? Now here's why they think their trap is so brilliant. What if Christ says yes? Well, then they're going to accuse him of treason to Judaism and violating the Torah and maybe prosecute him for blasphemy for that. On the other hand, what if he says no? Well, that will be consistent with the Torah, but that will be treason to Rome. So one way they think the Jews will have grounds to put him to death. The other way, whatever he says, they think the Romans will have it. So of course, what does he say? He says, show me the coin. Whose likeness and inscription are on the coin? They answer, Caesar's. And then Christ gives the famous answer, then render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And the crowd was so amazed that they gave up. Okay. Now, a second one. And notice this is the Sadducees. I chose these two so you'd see all three groups involved in this. But we have a series of at least 12 conspiracies that are recorded in the Gospels. But in this one involving the Sadducees, remember they denied resurrection. So it was a custom in Jewish law that if a man married a woman and he died, but the woman was left childless, then his brother would come and sleep with the widow to try to give her a child. And if that child was born, then that child would take the name of the dead brother. So the Sadducees, who reject immortality, want to trap Christ using his teaching of eternal life to do it. So they say there's a woman and she marries one brother and he dies without a child. She doesn't have a child. So his second brother comes, performs his function, and he dies, and it goes over 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. Now she's got on earth 7 husbands. If there is eternal life and she goes in heaven, then they ask him, whose husband will she be? Because if she's the husband of more than one, then there's a divorce. Of just one, then there's got to be 6 divorces. If she's the husband of all of them, then she's committing adultery with whomever she is with. And they think that he have him really in another box. And Christ says that when we get to heaven, we're not going to be like our life here on earth. When we get to heaven, we're going to be like the angels, and we won't reproduce sexually. So this stumps them again. And so time after time after time, we have these attempts by the Jews to trap Christ. Then finally, 2 days before Passover, they give up on trying to trap him, so they decide that they will get one of the people loyal to Christ to betray him, and that's when they reach a deal with Judas to identify Christ and so that they can arrest him. And they pay Judas 30 pieces of silver, and that 30 pieces of silver is what the law required if a healthy young male slave was accidentally killed, or it was the market price for a healthy young male slave. and that's the price that's then paid. So now I want to talk to you about Jewish law, and this, for me, is such a beautiful system that I am in awe every time I teach this. But before I get to the Mishnah and tell you what the Mishnah is, which is going to be our source for our trial procedures, Jewish law is built primarily on these three verses, Deuteronomy 16, 18, 19 through 20. And so the requirements that they have are that you have to have local judges, you have to render just judgments, you must base your fact findings on the evidence, you must base legal conclusions on the law and not your private opinion as a judge. Everyone must receive equal protection of the law, and you cannot have any bribes, obviously. Now, one of the things that's important is our founders who drafted the Constitution in Philadelphia in 1787, they knew these things. So many of these things are going to be built into our Constitution. So for instance, local judges, Sixth Amendment says that criminal trials have to be tried with judges that are appointed and established by law before it happens. Just judgments, this is what our due process clause requires. You must give due process or you can impair anyone's life, liberty, or property. That's in the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment. Base fact findings on the evidence and legal conclusions on the law. The evidence, that's a part of due process. Legal conclusions based on the law, that's our supremacy of Article 7 of the Constitution. Equal protection under the law, 14th Amendment. Every person is entitled to equal protection under the law, and no bribes. Any judge that engages in bad behavior under our Constitution is then subject to removal. So these principles established in Scripture are adopted in our Constitution. Now the Mishnah is what we're going to be referring to, and the Mishnah is compiled around 200 AD. Well, John, if it's 200 AD, why are we looking at it for Christ's trials that took place 200 years earlier? Well, after the temple fell in 70 AD, the movement began to try to codify the beliefs of the Pharisees primarily, and to put in written form the oral, unwritten statements that they believe were part of the Jewish law. And they believed that Moses received the written law at Sinai, but he also received unwritten law at Sinai as well. So they started compiling writings that date back from 50 BC. And then today, when this codified, today the Mishnah is still the basis for rabbinic Judaism today, and it has a very detailed provision on the Sanhedrin. And most scholars agree, and I agree with them, that the Mishnah's provisions regarding the Sanhedrin actually lay out the trial procedures that govern the Sanhedrin. So I want to look at those very, very quickly, and this is one of your tables as well, but it is a beautiful system. So let me begin by saying, if John were in my class, I'd make John stand up, and I'd say, look at John and remember the old Sylvester cartoons. Y'all remember Sylvester and Tweety Bird? Okay. Well, Tweety Bird was one of my early villain heroes. I always like intelligent villains. I find them very entertaining. And almost every cartoon is the little old lady with the umbrella will come in, and Tweety Bird has done something to frame Sylvester using circumstantial evidence. So Sylvester will have a big meal, and he'll be asleep, and Tweety Bird will go and put bird feathers around his mouth, and then leave the bird cage open where Tweety Bird's gone, right? And grandmother comes in, sees, and then just beats the tar out of Sylvester each time. Well, the reason she does that is because of circumstantial evidence. And today in Texas, here in Austin, Texas, you can actually be arrested for murder, convicted, and sentenced to death solely on circumstantial evidence. Think about that. Yet, under Jewish law, circumstantial evidence was never even admissible. So that's quite a contrast between our due process protections, of which we are rightly proud. You know, we're the second best in history, but I want to go over a little bit about how much better the Jewish system was. So, due process in the Western legal tradition has three elements: fair notice of what the crime is before you commit it, a fair trial that gives innocent people a fighting chance to prove their innocence, and then impartial judges. And we're going to go through very quickly the requirements of Jewish law for each of these, and then I want to tell you the most beautiful part of Jewish law are special rules that they have for capital cases like Christ. So, with regard to fair notice, one of the tricks I often did, and I trained the lawyers that worked with me to do it, you have your pleadings, you go to trial, and then you get into the trial, and then you try to surprise the other side and ask for a Rule 66 amendment, which allows you to change your pleadings and then put in new evidence that the other side never knew was coming on new charges, okay? And it's a trick that always worked, and judges were remarkably malleable in granting them, which I always thought was terribly unfair, which is why I did it, of course. So under Jewish law, you were never allowed to change charges once a trial begins. Now, the fair trial provision, officers could not touch a defendant, could not bind him, could not strike him, anything before he's convicted, and they could not do that to a witness either. Jewish law provided that no person could ever testify against himself, and even if the defendant confessed, that confession was absolutely inadmissible. You could never use a confession. It didn't matter. At public trial, no trials at night, on the Sabbath, or during festivals, because crimes were a wound that were best investigated during daylight. So you could not have trials at any time that the public would not be able to come and attend. All the trials had to be in the Sanhedrin's courtroom, and the judges were under constant public scrutiny. Every defendant then gets a right to make a defense. And here's the amazing thing. It wasn't until the Miranda case in 1965 that the Supreme Court held that the Sixth Amendment guarantee of a counsel, that if you can't afford a lawyer, the government will appoint one for you, 1965. The Jews had that 22 centuries ago. And what happened was, if you didn't have someone to represent you, one of the judges in the Sanhedrin had to step from his chair and be your advocate in front of the rest of the Sanhedrin. Next, I'm sorry, jumping ahead. So get to the admissibility of evidence. Only oral testimony from eyewitnesses would ever be permitted. No hearsay was allowed, and no circumstantial evidence was allowed. Now, if you have 5 witnesses, and one of those witnesses disagrees on an important detail with the other 4, the testimony of all 5 witnesses had to be thrown out. Y'all see how every possible consideration is given to the defendant. Every witness was forced to testify twice. You had to testify individually in front of the Sanhedrin, and then they brought all the witnesses together to testify again, to make sure that no one was saying something that wasn't true. And every witness, both times, was subjected to basically unlimited cross-examination. In addition to this, you had to have 2 impartial witnesses. One of their most important maxims is one witness is no witness at all. And if there were any contradictions, again, in any of the evidence, all the evidence had to be thrown out. And no false witnesses were permitted, and this is a really interesting aspect. I had, around 66 major trials that went on average 6 to 8 weeks at least. In these trials, I examined or cross-examined thousands of witnesses. And unfortunately, I'm here to tell you, there was not a single witness that told the truth all the way through the entire time. Yet I never saw a prosecution for perjury over the 40 years that I tried lawsuits, not one. Jewish law was quite different. Under Jewish law, bearing false witness was a serious crime and the punishment was swift. So if I were to be a false witness against someone and they were facing the death penalty, then that was my punishment, was the death penalty. Now, in addition to this, y'all know the story about the woman that was caught in sin, and Christ said, whoever's here without sin, cast the first stone. Well, the story behind that is, when it came punishment time, if someone was going to be stoned to death, the person who had to throw the first stone was the primary witness who had gotten their conviction. That's kind of a burden. So, if you bore false witness and then you threw the first stone, you were guilty of both being a false witness and murder as well. So all these protections then are to protect innocent parties. Now, no one could be a sole judge, unlike in our system where we often have just one judge hearing the case. Only God could be a sole judge. The reason for this is the Jews recognize that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So in addition to that, the Sanhedrin was never permitted to go out and initiate investigations because they don't want political prosecutions. The Sanhedrin could only hear cases that were brought to them by members of the public. There had to be at least one judge that advocated for the defense, When there was a conviction, there had to be a majority of at least 2, and there could never be a unanimous conviction. If someone was convicted unanimously, he walked, he was set free, because it was presumed that a unanimous conviction was the product of collusion. Then lastly, and this is one of the most beautiful things about this, there were limit on trials involving capital cases. The Sanhedrin could not hear more than 1 trial per day if the death sentence was involved. And there could not be an execution until the day after the conviction, the trial was over. The reason for this is that the Sanhedrin had to reconvene and vote a second time. And after the emotion had died down on the second day, you could change your vote if you had voted guilty. You could change it from guilty to not guilty. But if you had voted that the person was innocent, you could not change your vote. So again, every consideration was given to try to protect innocent parties. When someone was being taken to be convicted, there's a spot, and we know where the spot is, where the stonings took place. So that there's Jerusalem is largely, it's very stony, limestone, and there's a short cliff. They would take the defendant who was about to be executed, would drop him on his head. The reason they did that was the hope that that would kill him. And only if he survived being dropped on his head and his or her neck was not broken, then would they be stoned. But the beautiful thing about their system was, every 30 feet or so, when they were walking from the temple to the spot where the conviction would take place, there were flagmen with yellow flags, soldiers that would stand there. And as he walked slowly across there, if he himself said, "I forgot something I want to say in my defense," everything stopped, and they had to start the entire trial process all over again. If someone in the public said, "I didn't know that he was being tried. I'm a witness. I know what happened. You need to hear my testimony," they would stop everything, and the entire trial would be begun again. So it was really quite a wonderful system, many more due process protections than we have in our country today. Now, Christ is going to be convicted of blasphemy by the Sanhedrin. And what I want to point out to you as well is that the Sanhedrin is very clear about what constitutes blasphemy, and there's only one crime that qualifies. And Christ is not going to be guilty of this, obviously. But for blasphemy to happen, you have to curse God and ask God himself to curse God, but you have to use the actual name of God, which the Jews are forbidden to speak. So when I taught at A&M for several years, I had an Orthodox Jewish student, and it was a philosophy course, and so we were going over the arguments for God, and this young man came up very respectfully, and I had handed out a chart, and he brought the chart back, holding it very carefully, and put it on my desk. I said, "I have to give this back to you." I said, "No, that's for you to keep." He says, "No, I can't do it." I said, "Why?" He said, "You have the word God on the chart, and I would be committing a sin or crime if I were to fold the chart." That's the reverence with which they held the name of God. So what would happen is a person would be tried for blasphemy, and they would hear this testimony, but the witness would not use God's name in the testimony. They would just say he used God's name. And then if the person was potentially going to be convicted, they would then send everybody except the judges out. And then the only time that Jews were ever permitted to actually state the name of God, they would have the witness say exactly what they heard the blasphemer say. But unless you use the name of God with the tetragrammaton to curse God, then you're not going to be guilty of blasphemy. So, the 6 trials then. Now, one of the things that happened, I always want to say this, particularly because I have Jewish students. The trial of Christ has been used through history many times as an excuse for anti-Semitism, and I have to say, Scripture tells us that the Jews are a blessing to those who bless them and a curse to those who curse them, and we are not permitted to be anti-Semitic. And one of the things I want to tell you about this, I've read many books before I got to go over and visit these sites, but one of the writers said that he didn't think it was the Jews who were present at these trials, the Jews themselves. He has the theory that it was just soldiers and servants that actually worked for Annas and Caiaphas in a small group that were there. And I thought, well, this doesn't make any sense. But if you get to go to Jerusalem and ever get to visit there, the streets inside the ancient city are only about as wide as this seating section here. And this has what? 6 seats across. They're extremely narrow, extremely narrow. And some of these are the same streets that Christ walked through as he goes through his final day. And after going there, I became convinced that it was very easy to have 30 or 40 soldiers that would surround Christ and maybe dressed in plain clothes, as Pilate often had them do, or the Jewish employees at the temple, and walk around Christ and hide him from the crowd, and they could move all around the city and people wouldn't even know. So I'm now convinced, after having been there, that it wasn't really the masses of the people. As I'm going to show you, they're saying crucify him, crucify him. I think that they probably were largely paid employees of the temple hierarchy. But what I wanted to do was also impress on you how small everything is over there, especially compared to what we're used to living in Texas. So the upper room, we believe, is right about here. And after the Last Supper, then they go up to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now this looks like a short distance, and it is from left to right, but up and down it is huge. And the Mount of Olives, where the garden is extremely steep. And there's a whole industry, particularly for American tourists. I went about 5 years ago and I was able to make it, but I was huffing and puffing by the time I got there. But there are people for $25 to $50, you can ride in a golf cart up there, and there's a long line of people waiting to get there. So it takes a while to get up to the garden. But Christ is going to be arrested in the garden, and then he's going to be taken to the house of Caiaphas, and you can walk this going downhill. You can walk this in about 10 minutes. So Annas' house and Caiaphas' house are only separated by a courtyard about the size of this room. So the first 2 trials take place, they're very short, they take place there. Then you walk to the Sanhedrin, which would meet here on the Temple Mount in the Hall of Hewn Stone. He's going to be tried there. Then he's going to be walked over very, very quickly to what they call the Praetorium, which is the judicial setting for Pilate for the 4th trial. Pilate's going to see an opportunity to send Christ to the palace of Herod Antipas, who's in town for Passover at this time. And then Herod Antipas is not going to bite the bait and doesn't want to get politically involved either, so he's going to send him back to Pilate. So all of this, I walked one day, it took me 35 minutes. So all of this could very easily happen early in the morning. Now, the arrest in the garden takes place. What I want to do is point out to you as we go through, if you look at your last page, if this is something I did when I appealed cases, I would write down violations of the law that would require reversal and go through different witnesses and do an X. But these are, I think, 38 of the requirements of the Mishnah for trial of criminal defendants that are violated in these trials. And the X will show each one down here, and we'll just talk very briefly about them. So after he's arrested in the garden, and remember, Judas comes up and gives him a kiss. So just as an example of the violations of law that are involved in this, the Sanhedrin cannot originate charges, but here they go out and they arrest the guy. That's against Jewish law. It's strictly forbidden. They cannot participate in the arrest, yet the Gospels tell us that men from the temple for the Sanhedrin were there, and no criminal proceedings can occur after sunset. We think this was between 2 and 3 a.m. in the morning. These times, by the way, are estimations. We don't know for sure. So just in the arrest, they violate the rule against starting your own proceedings. They initiated their own case. They bound Christ before he was convicted. It was the eve of the Sabbath, which was not permitted. It was conducted at night, which was not permitted. It was conducted during the Passover trial, which was not permitted. He was never told of the charges against him. And lastly, they used a traitor. And you could not have people like in our drug enforcement laws. The game is always to get a lower level participant in the drug conspiracy and put pressure on him to rat out, as they say in the movies, the people above him to get to Mr. Big, whoever that is. Strictly forbidden under Jewish law. If you were ever in a position of trust, you could never testify against that person. And in fact, if you did violate your position of trust, you yourself were guilty of a crime as well. So here's Caravaggio, my favorite artist. Here's the picture of Judas kissing Christ in the garden. Now, our first trial then is going to go over, and how am I doing on time? 10 minutes. I'm going to have to go pretty quickly. So I'm just going to focus on the evidence at the trial. First trial is in Annas' house, and they take him to Annas, and Annas says, there's no accusations and no proof. Christ remained silent, but Annas then asked him whether or not he is the Christ, and he's said these things and what his movement is. And Christ remained silent during this whole time because Annas doesn't have any witnesses. And Christ knows if he remains silent under Jewish law that he cannot be convicted. So he then tells Annas, if you want to prove these things, get a witness, because everything I did was in the open. And at this time then, a soldier strikes him, and then Christ is sent across the little short walkway there to Caiaphas' house. So in addition to what we've seen before, the judges in the second trial had not fasted as required. There was no morning sacrifice as required. No defense witnesses were permitted. No impartial judges. There was a single judge. Christ was struck while he was questioned. His right against self-incrimination was violated. There were no corroborating witnesses, and there had to be at least two. And it was not a public proceeding in the Sanhedrin's meeting room in the temple, in addition to everything that was violated with the garden. Now, when Christ is being taken from Annas' house, just across this courtyard, is when we have the incident where Peter denies Christ 3 times. And remember, at the Last Supper, Christ asked Peter if he loved him, and Peter says absolutely, and Christ predicts that before the cock crows this morning, you will deny me 3 times. So 3 different people will ask Peter, aren't you with him? Don't you know him? And 3 times he will deny that he knows Christ. On the 3rd time, as soon as he says it, the rooster crows and he realizes that he has fulfilled the prophecy that Christ made for him. But the beautiful aspect of this, which is why I think the Lord let it happen, is later Christ, after the resurrection, will ask Peter 3 times, Peter, do you love me? For each of the denials. And each time Peter will say, yes, Lord, you know that I do. And then Christ will say, then feed my sheep. So that's a beautiful story there. Now, he's taken across to Caiaphas, and in Caiaphas' house now, members of the Sanhedrin have joined. They're aware of the conspiracy. We don't know how many were there. There's a total of 72 in the Sanhedrin. But they joined, and then they question him, and they bring in false witnesses. The false witnesses who come in say falsely that Christ said that he could rebuild the temple in 3 days. And that's not at all what Christ said. Christ talked about his body as a temple, as a metaphor, and that he would rise again in 3 days. So then Caiaphas says, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed, and Son of Man, sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven? And at this, Caiaphas is going to tear his clothes, and then he's going to say, what need do we have of any further witnesses? And they find him guilty of blasphemy. But before they pronounce a death penalty on him, they want to make it a show trial to make it look like it's a legitimate trial. So then we go and we see before Caiaphas, he was convicted on his own testimony. They used false witnesses. The high priest is never allowed to rend his garments. Other priests are, but the high priest is never allowed. Convicted on false testimony is a capital trial that took place in 1 day. Death penalty was given without the second day vote. It was a unanimous death sentence. Changes occurred during the trial because the allegation went from that he would raise the temple in 3 days to that he was the Son of God. And then lastly, Christ is going to be mocked there despite his innocence. That then gets us then to our 4th trial. Here, by the way, is the eagle, Roman eagle that Herod put in the temple. So we're going to be here now, right behind this wall, for the 4th trial, which is a very, very important one. The others have been kind of preliminary at this point. I'm sorry, the 3rd trial. And this is how the Sanhedrin's area looked. And there are going to be 3 groups of 23. The 3 groups are going to be the scribes, the priests, the elders, scribes. And just to go over it very quickly because I'm running short of time, they would sit in a horseshoe here, 3 times 23, give them a total of 69 members, and then there were 2 presiding officers who would vote, so there would be a total of 71. And then the accused would stand right here in front. Now, who were they? The high priests were obviously the priest hierarchy from the temple. The elders were laymen that had been very successful in life, sort of like the English used to do with their knighthoods. And then the scribes were people who originally could write, and they would write things out, but most of what they wrote was the law. And so they became considered experts in the laws. So when you see scribes, you can think also lawyers as well. So those are the 3 groups that are there. So I'm going to have to skip through here and get then to the proof. So the accusation then is going to be blasphemy, but remember, blasphemy requires that Christ use the name of God in calling down a curse on God, and that is not anything that happened. So Christ is initially going to remain silent. Then Caiaphas is going to say, are you the Son of God? Then Christ is going to say, yes, that I am. And then they proclaim we don't need any more witnesses, and then they declare him guilty of blasphemy and sentence him to death. Okay? So we have all of these violations that are on your table that you have there. Now remember, Annas, who had been high priest, lost his job as high priest because he executed a convicted man without getting Rome's permission. So they've learned a lesson, and Caiaphas is not about to make the same mistake because Caiaphas doesn't want to lose his position. So they go then before Pilate. And this is kind of show you this theory that maybe it wasn't really a large group of Jews that were accompanying people when they went there. But here's a painting of Pilate sitting there, and this is at the edge, the western edge of the fortress there that the Romans had. So this trial is very, very interesting. Pilate immediately says, what are the charges against this man? And the Jews have no witnesses at all because blasphemy is not a crime under Roman law. So Caiaphas kind of looks at his feet and stirs around and says, well, Pilate, if he was not a bad man, we would not have brought him to you, which is not much of an argument, okay? So Pilate then says, there's no charge against him under Roman law. Go deal with him according to your law. And then they say, but we cannot put him to death under our law unless you approve it. And then they recover, and Caiaphas comes up, changes the charges, and comes up with violations of Roman law, which are treason. So he's going to have 3 allegations of treason. The first is that Christ claims to be a king, which is treason to Caesar. Second, that Christ refuses to pay taxes, and that, of course, was a lie. Christ always pays his taxes throughout the gospel. And then third, that he incites treason. He's perverting the nation to treason. So these are the 3 allegations of treason. So Pilate then is going to interrogate Christ. He's going to say famously, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus will answer, are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you this about me? And then Pilate responds, I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priest delivered you to me. What have you done? Skip down. Pilate then says, so you are a king. And then Christ says, you say correctly that I'm a king. For this I've been born, and for this I've come into the world to testify to the truth. And everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And then we get this famous enigmatic line when Pilate says, what is truth? Well, many commentators will say this is one of the great ironies in human history because living truth is standing there right before him and he doesn't recognize him. But I want you for a second to put yourself into Pilate's position. And what I think Pilate means by this is that he recognizes this trial is not about justice. This trial is about his holding on to power. And like I like to say, it's about the truth of Pilate's power and not about the power of Christ's truth. And when he says, what is truth, I think he's just saying, like, well, what's money? What is this? It's something that's irrelevant to me. And that's what I think is really going on. But Pilate still, in his humanity, is still going to try to do the right thing. So he's going to go and he says, I find no fault in him at all. And then they say, but he stirs up the people to revolt all the way from here to Galilee. And when Pilate hears that, he thinks, now I've got a way out. He's a Galilean. Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, is down here in Jerusalem now. I'm going to send him over to Herod. And so Pilate tries to avoid making a final decision in the case. So then we go over and we get to Herod, and the chief priests and scribes from the Sanhedrin are there. The Bible doesn't tell us what the charges are that they make, but we do know that at first Herod Antipas, who's responsible for the beheading of John the Baptist, is concerned that Christ is then the reincarnated John the Baptist. And when he finds that this is not true, then he famously wants Christ to perform some miracle or some show to entertain his court. And he begins to interrogate Christ, but Christ will not answer any of his questions. So then he becomes vexed, but he's smart enough to not get involved in this. So he sends him back to Pilate, says, I'm not going to make a decision. You go back to Pilate. But as was prophesied, Christ will be mocked and mistreated at Herod's court. And then we come back to the famous last trial, very, very important trial. So there's no new charges and there's been no proof of any wrongdoing. So Pilate, what I'd like you to do, if you'll look at the last page, I'm going to skip over this part, and what I want to do is talk about the 4 times that Pilate's going to try to save Christ. And this is something for which Pilate, I think, he's caricatured. He's really more complex. Now remember, his primary goal is to maintain peace and order so that he can maintain his position. And you've seen the troubles that he's had with the Jews, largely because he doesn't understand their religious views, and he doesn't understand people that are not motivated either by sex, money, or power, like the Jews are. And so they're a mystery to him, sort of like these computers are to me. I'm dependent completely on John to make them work. So the long scripture is here with important language in red, but the first attempt takes place the first time that Christ is before Pilate. So remember, at Passover, the Jews had a custom that one of their criminal prisoners would be released as a show of grace, as a symbolic release. And so Pilate goes to them and says, do you wish for me to release to you the King of the Jews? So he's hoping that the Jews will let him release Christ, and that will be the end of the story. But they say, no, not this man, but Barabbas. Well, who was Barabbas? Barabbas was a notorious highwayman, criminal, and murderer. So the Jews who are there around Christ shout that they want Barabbas instead of Christ. So the first attempt is going to fail. The second attempt, at the last trial, Pilate has the man scourged. And y'all, if you've seen the Mel Gibson movie, I watched it once. I bought it, watched it once. I barely got through it. When you think that I'm the reason he had to go through that, it's very condemning. So I recommend to my students that they watch it if they haven't seen it, but the scourging is just awful. And so Pilate lets them go after him and then presents the man, the famous Ecce Homo line, behold the man, hoping that seeing Christ's pitiable condition will satisfy their bloodlust for him. What do they say? Crucify, crucify. And Pilate then says, take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no grounds for the charges in this case. Then next he says, shall I crucify your king? And then the Jews shout back, we have no king but Caesar. How ironic, okay? Then lastly, in the fourth attempt, when they shout, crucify him, Pilate says, why? What evil has he done? I'm innocent of this man's blood, you yourself shall see. And then the Jews call a curse upon themselves, his blood be upon ourselves and on our children. And then at this point, then he releases Barabbas, and then he turns Christ over to be crucified. Now, what happened to our major characters? Josephus tells us what happens to Pilate. Samaria is the area of the northern kingdom during the unified monarchy. There's a revolt there based on the false Sumerian counterfeit Jewish religion. And Pilate is very, very brutal in how he puts down that revolt. He's so brutal that it even offends the Romans, who are a brutal military people. And so then his boss orders him back to Rome, and Pilate goes back to Rome to be punished, but Caesar dies before Pilate gets there. So we know from a man named Eusebius, who was one of the early bishops in the early church, he writes that Pilate was exiled to Vienne in France, which is a pretty town on the Rhone River, and that eventually there he committed suicide. But some people question the suicide, that maybe that was just too nice of a story for Eusebius's work, but nevertheless, that's what he says. Now, this is an ossuary. If you don't know what an ossuary was, it was the Jewish custom that the body would be exposed to the elements, not out in the street, but eventually when the flesh was gone away, they would take the bones of a loved one and put them into a bone box, into an ossuary. And in Bible archaeology today, in 1992, they found this ossuary, which is in the museum. The ossuary is about this long and about this wide. They believe that this is Caiaphas's bones. Annas, we only have one more mention of Annas when he sits in judgment on Peter and John. Caiaphas, we had this ossuary, we think that that's what happened to him. but there's not much written about them. Then Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was really a backstabbing politico, completely ruthless, but he gets outmaneuvered by his brother-in-law. So when Tiberius dies and Caligula comes to power, his brother-in-law secretly communicates with the new Caligula Caesar and says, hey, Herod Antipas was one of your political enemies before you became Caesar, and he had lots of correspondence with the previous Caesar trying to keep you down. So this Caligula believes him, makes him angry, so he takes away Herod Antipas's power and all of his wealth, and then sends him to Spain, and he's banished there. Herodias, remember, who divorced her second husband to marry Herod Antipas, she's offered to keep her power and position, and she gives it up to go be with Herod Antipas and live in Spain in exile. And then our last character then is Judas. It was predicted, of course, that the money would be thrown into the temple, so Judas feels guilty and guilt-ridden for what he did, so he takes the money and he throws the money back into the temple, and the priests say, what does this have to do with us? This is blood money, we don't want it. So they take it, and then they buy a potter's field where strangers who die in Jerusalem will be buried. And there's a traditional location where this was, but who knows if those are true. But that's the end of the story, and I hope that this maybe gives a little bit more meaning to you, to the sacrifices that our Lord made and what he endured leading up to the crucifixion. And I very much appreciate your attention.
So earlier you talked about circumstantial evidence and how in Texas you can be convicted via circumstantial evidence, and the insinuation was that maybe that wasn't a good practice. Now, J. Warner Wallace, who's going to be here next week, who's a cold case investigator, in his book, either God's Crime Scene or Cold Case Christianity, he talks about how most all of his convictions have been through circumstantial evidence, and not just one piece of circumstantial evidence, but a collective body that is very incriminating. So could you elaborate on circumstantial evidence and how valid or invalid or important?
The law is very important to the flourishing of a society, and law has got two competing concerns. One is to protect the innocent, and the other is to maintain order and keep innocent people safe. And these are going to conflict at some times. So circumstantial evidence is fine. I used it all the time. I don't think it's immoral, or it's a lesser evidence than direct evidence, but the standard that we have is you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And circumstantial evidence can come up to that. If you have circumstantial evidence coming from 15 different directions so that there's no other possibility other than guilt, then that's fine. But my point in this was to emphasize how we kind of put in our society, the fulcrum, if you think of justice as we used to call them seesaw. My wife's from Amarillo, so there's a teeter-totter, and now I don't know which one it is, but call it a seesaw. We kind of put the fulcrum in the middle between these two interests of maintaining order, but also protecting the innocent. The Jews had their fulcrum way over, almost to the end of the board, in protecting the innocent. And that is something that I think is really remarkable. For instance, if someone confesses and the confession is voluntary and they know the significance of what they're confessing to and what's going to do to them if they confess, as long as it's voluntary, then I have no problem with accepting it. But the Jews, of course, would not accept it at all. Now, their law was derived from their understanding of Scripture, and then they added on to it, okay, but all based on Deuteronomy. So it's not really to condemn our system so much as it is to emphasize just how amazing the Jewish legal system was in its protection of due process rights. But the reason for that is to show how horrible these trials were because they ignored all these protections. And so one of the important principles of any legal system is what we call the sovereignty of law, which has three elements. The political rulers must obey the law themselves. They must enforce the law themselves. And then you must also have laws wield supremacy over the political rulers, so you have a government of laws, not a government of men. We are very far away from that in contemporary current events today. You look at selective enforcement of the laws, look at our immigration laws, that both Republicans and Democrats, for different motives, but for political motives both, have ignored enforcement of those laws. Every society, and this is one of the reasons I teach, every society that ignores the sovereignty of law has perished, every one, generally as a result of their ignoring the sovereignty of law. So I guess I gave much more than you were asking for.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And I apologize in advance, my question is probably going to require a seminar-length answer.
My son is familiar with those. There's a lot of family stories about that.
It was my understanding at the founding of the country that they modeled both the government and law after the Bible and the Jewish model. My question is, was there ever a point in American history where American jurisprudence matched the Jewish law, and if not, did the founding fathers give a rationale for why?
That's a wonderful and beautiful question, and let me say this: the American legal system at the time of the founding, I think, is the highest achievement of Western civilization, and largely the legal system as of the time is found in Blackstone's commentaries on the common laws of England. Okay. Now Blackstone and I tell my students I'm very much like Blackstone was. I've never had an original idea in my life, except how to deceive my wife to marry me. Okay, that was the original scheme. But other than that, and Blackstone really was not an original guy either, but he was a compiler, a scholar going in the past. So Jewish law is an influence, English common law is an influence, but Roman law is also a very important influence as well. So the thing that was most important at the founding was the role that judges played. And Blackstone, from a guy named Matthew Hale, a guy named John Selden, and goes all the way back to 200 AD with a Roman jurist named Marcellus, Justinian in 535 particularly, they have a rule that's called, we call it today the declaratory rule of law, which is judges may never make new law. Judges only find the law, declare it, and apply it. The reason for that is if you let the judges exercise a legislative power or an executive power other than the judicial power, it's always tyrannical. And so Blackstone has a long discussion of historical times where that's happened. Now the most famous example of this is Athens, where Athens had a trial where they executed in the middle of the Peloponnesian War. Their 8 generals had just won a huge victory over Sparta, and they put them all to death as reward because some sailors had been left in the water after a big naval battle when a hurricane or a typhoon came up and made it impossible for them to get it. So that's an example where the jurors in Athens were allowed to make their own law in every case. So and then the next year they lose this 35-year war to Sparta, and Athens is destroyed. So as you go through history, though, there were 3 English civil wars in basically the 1650s, led to Charles I having his head cut off. The 3 things that caused that led directly to it, were corrupt judges violating the established law. Then you go back, so that's in the 1640s. Then you go fast forward to the 1680s, and James II does exactly the same thing. We have 3 cases that I teach there that then led to the Glorious Revolution, but it also led to the English Bill of Rights. And the English Bill of Rights is the model for our Bill of Rights. The first 2 paragraphs of the English Bill of Rights hold that judges cannot make new law. Now look at our Constitution today. I just finished giving a seminar in 4 different cities to a lot of high school teachers on this topic on judicial review. Judicial review is the power that the Supreme Court uses now to take over and review any action by any government entity in our country. Judicial review is never a power that is given to them in the Constitution. It's not there. And they ignore the text of the Constitution when they do it. And there's a man named Judge Robert Yates who was an anti-federalist in 1788, who said, wait, don't ratify this Constitution with Article 3 because there's no significant check and balance on the Supreme Court. And if you don't have that check and balance, we're going to have the same thing happen here as happened in England. And so what happens is, originally the Supreme Court has no jurisdiction over state laws. But yet, what we have today, my lifetime has been defined by the political interest in this country who fail through democratic process to achieve their political goals, now go to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court will legislate. And this is exactly the same sort of thing that happened that led to civil wars in England, the Glorious Revolution, and has always been the downfall of every country where we allowed this to happen. And so that's one of the main things that I teach. So the departure, how this happened, were judges getting all this power? There was a movement beginning in the 1950s by a guy named H.L.A. Hart that was actually begins with Oliver Wendell Holmes in the 1870s to get all morality out of our law. Now think about that. They actually the famous lecture is The Separation of Law and Morality that took place at Harvard Law School. In 1870, Harvard Law School dropped Blackstone as part of their curriculum. Up until that time, he was about 80% of the curriculum of every law school in the country. They dropped Blackstone, that is heavily influenced by Christianity and moral values, to adopt an idea of what we call the model of rules. Law is nothing but man-made rules, and there is no sense of justice. Oliver Wendell Holmes on the Supreme Court of the United States said, there's no such thing as justice. Lawyers arguing over justice is like this is his example, two drunks in a bar arguing over whose girlfriend is prettier. It has no more meaning than that. So that's how we got to this court that we have now, and then once the Supreme Court becomes politicized, it just becomes politics through another means, and the Constitution, which is established to guarantee the rights of the political minority, no matter what the political majority becomes, it can no longer function as a constitution because we've transformed from a government of laws to a government of judges. And Aristotle, in his famous Politics, gives the famous statement. He says, man beset by passion is the worst of all creatures, and that's why we have to have a government by law and not a government by men, because even the best of men is beset by passion from time to time. That was almost a seminar answer. But did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
That's awesome.
Yes, sir.
So Lacey first?
No, Lacey's first.
Go ahead, Lacey.
I'm over here.
Oh, okay. Hi, it's good to see you again. Yeah.
So you said that Annas was the former high priest.
Yes.
So I wondered, being the former high priest, what office or authority he held to be able to preside over the first trial?
He was very much a Don Corleone type figure, okay? And he used any number of devices, but 5 of his sons and son-in-laws were high priests as well. So as their father, he controlled them indirectly. And he also had control of all the financial interests there. And Josephus tells us that all of the secular rulers lived in fear of him because of his political influence. And one of the things that's a kind of a backstory to all this is all of these rulers in this area, they're directly communicating with Caesar all the time. And they will have these conspiracies, they'll have political enemies, and they'll send false reports to Caesar, but Caesar will still act on them. So it's a combination of family control, financial control, and political control of power.
Official power.
No official, that's right, no official power. But he's viewed, I think correctly so, as really the main guy behind the conspirators and the conspiracies to kill Christ. And he's a very relentless guy. And he sees, having lost power himself directly, having the title, he sees that if Christ succeeds, what they fear, and the people begin to follow Christ instead of following the temple and the legalism of the temple ritual life that is the financial pipeline for him, that he may lose his wealth and then indirectly his power as well. But that's a great question. Yes, sir.
And that's Carolina.
really didn't know anything about the Jewish law, caring about testifying against yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, first question from the Bible, was Jesus referencing that in a completely different circumstance when he said, if I testified about myself, it would mean nothing but,
Wow. That's a great idea. I think you're probably right on that. But I'm not a theologian, and I don't want to get outside of my area. Yeah, but I think that here's the thing about knowledge. I'm now getting close to 70, and I've got all these degrees and stuff, and all they do is show me new things that I don't have any idea what. You see what I'm saying? You just become increasingly aware of your ignorance. And so every time I teach this course, every spring, a student will come up with something that just blows me away that I should have seen. For instance, in the Federalist Papers, the most famous line of that is Madison says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary, or if men were governed by angels, we wouldn't need these checks and balances. So that's kind of holy writ, oh my gosh, this is the great Madison writing that. Well, I had an undergraduate student said, well, you know where he came up with that, right? I'm thinking Madison's this great genius, right? I said, no. He says, it comes right out of John Calvin. And so I went and I looked, and that's exactly right. So these connections, I'm excited now because I'm going to look this up this afternoon. But these connections get made all the time. And so it's knowledge is really kind of a web, and everything's connected to each other. But I bet that you're right on that. That's a first-rate thought.
I had a practical, how should I've been in, well, might as well be honest, I've been in 2 proceedings, so the first time you're supposed to be honest, so I just really distressed the judge by I said I did it, and she said, you can't say that, we're going to pretend we didn't hear that, we're going to go through the procedure. So I personally despise everybody that won't admit what they did. So this is just completely strange to me, that you're saying not only that even if they did in a perfect proceeding, it wouldn't be allowed. So
there's a policy for that. Can I tell you what the policy is?
Yes.
The policy is because of the fallen nature of people with authority. So for instance, the direct antecedent for our having Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination is in England, the Court of the Star Chamber. If y'all heard the story on Galileo and the inquisitorial system, you were arrested, you're never told the charges, not allowed a lawyer, not allowed to talk to anybody. They could torture you, you could never hear the evidence, all this stuff. Well, England, the Stuarts and the Tudors adopted this as well as an instrument of political terror. And one of the things they would do, the only limit on their power to torture was they could not intentionally kill you. So one of the things that would happen, they wanted you to admit to treason so that you'd be put to death. Well, one of the things that would happen, there was a custom that came out. Y'all have heard the phrase, I feel so weighed down today. I don't know if y'all ever feel that way. I feel that way most of the time. Okay, but the procedure in the Star Chamber was they would take a man who was accused of treason, just the king's political enemy. Well, what happens if you're convicted of treason? Well, you lose your life and all your property, and your children for 3 generations cannot own property. It's a bad thing, okay? And generally your wife ends up a prostitute or starves to death because nobody will deal with her. So what they would do is they'd put a sharp rock under your spine, and they would start weighing you down. They would put heavy stones on your body so that you either eventually died of suffocation or from the sharp rock breaking your spine. And the agreement that came up was the Star Chamber, if you admitted to treason or died during torture, then they would leave your family alone. I hate to keep going back to the Godfather movies, but remember there's one of them where they go and they say, the lawyer goes into the guy who's testifying before a congressional committee and says, you remember what the Romans used to do? They just go and kill themselves. And so he kills himself in the bathroom on the promise that the Corleones will leave his family alone. Well, it's the same sort of thing that happened then. So they have learned that the only way to avoid coercion to try to get confessions is to put really strict limits on them. And the Jews just didn't think that any limits would be successful. So that's the reason, not because people shouldn't be held accountable for what they did, but to stop law enforcement of the ancient day from abusing them to get false confessions.
If every move shows them backing somebody into a corner and finally they say, okay, I did it. Okay, well then that shouldn't count. So how should it roll out in two cases where somebody finally has a pang of conscience 20 years after, or 5 years after he kills somebody, turns himself in? How should that trial proceed? And also, when somebody throws up his hands and says, I did it, should that be stricken and they still need to prove him?
No, it's got to, under current procedure, okay, they have to have their Miranda warnings beforehand, okay, and then the confession will be allowed in. But the confession's got to be, the Supreme Court's terms are voluntary and intelligent. That's an unfortunate word, that it should be voluntary and knowing. That's what the later cases say. So it's got to be completely voluntary, their own will, and then they have to understand that if they confess, that they're going to be punished, most likely. But there's nothing to stop you from going to do that. But look at our law enforcement today with defund the police and the bail policies that we have. So in Harris County, and I may get in trouble with this, but I don't care anymore because I'm an old man, I'm not practicing anymore. We have a DA. I knew her daddy. Her daddy was a longtime judge, a great, tremendous judge, state court back in my day. And she got elected, funded by George Soros, and came in with many of these, what I think are horrible ideas that are breaking down the law enforcement efforts in our community. But now it's gone so far that now she is being attacked politically because she's trying to maintain some order as well. But you have these people that go and they don't even require bail and just release them on their own recognizance. And didn't we just have one that was involved in the Sacramento mass shooting, and then another one last week or a couple of days ago that pushed somebody into a subway? Or, I mean, it's just a terrible, terrible thing. Yes, sir.
Yes, a question about the comment you made about the fallen nature of those in authority. Just thinking about those days before Jesus was given to Annas, that the Sanhedrin were considering him, and in effect giving him a trial, if you will, and could not decide, and that's when they decided to take him to Annas. And I just wonder, why did they not consider that as a trial?
Oh, that's, we have a phrase, I hate this word, but I don't have another simile, heuristic effect. So when I'm teaching students, many of my students come to me, I have a surprising number of Muslim students and Jewish students, and they have never heard the story before. So I just arbitrary, it's not really a trial. When he's interrogated there, I just say there are 6 trials to show that there are 6 episodes and what happens. But he never really receives a full trial as we would think of a trial at all. It's just 6 different locations. Did that answer your question?
I was thinking about if it was considered a trial, it would have been 7, and that's the perfect number.
That's a good thought too. See, this is why I love talking to RTV. I mean, this is great. Was there, sir? Did you have a?
Okay, it probably went right over my head, but at any point during these 6 trials of Jesus, did he have an advocate or someone
No.
who spoke in his defense, and wasn't that a requirement?
Absolutely. He was supposed to have a requirement in the Sanhedrin, but also he really was not allowed to make a defense in many of these too. That's why there's so many violations of Jewish law. That's why I did that chart. And the students hated it first because they have to know every one of them. But then after they learn it, they always tell me at the end of the semester, thank you for making us learn this. Because the real point of this in my courses is so that you understand it doesn't do you any good to have all these due process protections if you don't have sovereignty of law, where our judges and our political officers are bound by the law. You know, in the Constitution of the United States, there is the take care clause that the president takes an oath that he will fully and faithfully execute the laws of the United States. He takes an oath that he'll do it. You can't just sit there and exercise, quote unquote, prosecutorial discretion and decide which laws you like and which laws you don't. And he doesn't have the power to issue these orders like he does, these mandates, which the Supreme Court overturned 9-0. But the erosion of power, of the separation of powers, and the ignoring of checks and balances is exactly what happened with the 2 triumvirates at the end of the Republic of Rome. And I feel very much one of my favorite characters of history is a man named Cicero. You've heard his name. Cicero was the 2nd greatest speaker in the ancient world. He was had held the highest office in Rome and was the most successful lawyer in Rome. And he left his law practice and spent the last 5 or 10 years of his life trying to restore the Roman Constitution and writing works to restore the moral character of the Roman people and explain to them how they were losing their republic and what was going to happen. And that's exactly, I'm not Cicero, but it's the same path that I've taken. The bad thing about it is Cicero was then murdered by Mark Antony, and they cut off his head and they cut off his hands and they nail him up in the Forum. So I'm hoping that doesn't happen to me. But he ultimately fails. But all we can do is do our best to try to restore constitutional government. But ultimately, in my view, it's a spiritual problem. It's the spiritual problem that has caused this erosion.
Got one back here.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for a fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
Professor Tyler. I have newfound respect for the rule of law, especially having sat through the first 5 episodes of the thing about Ham. My question is, why did the powers that be feel it necessary to kill Jesus as opposed to some other means of getting rid of him, like imprisonment or deportation?
I had a limitation on the time, but that question is really answered by they don't start out wanting to kill him. They start out wanting to embarrass and humiliate him. And so, for instance, they'll try to outsmart him and give him questions he cannot answer, time and time and time again. And then when he raises Lazarus from the dead, think about that, okay? You're a Jew, you're in town for the Passover, and here's this dude that's raised a guy from the dead. Well, that made an impression on people, and that's when they get together, the temple conspirators, as I like to call them, and that's when they make the decision that this man has to die. And that's when Caiaphas makes the speech that he has to die so that we can save all the people. It's better that one man dies than the whole nation will perish with the Romans. So they don't really start out that way. They start out, they're offended by him, or their financial income is destroyed by Christ cleansing the temple and his teachings, but then he's becoming popular, and then he raises Lazarus from the dead, and then we've got the Jews that have been spread all over the world are in town for the Passover, and everything just kind of builds, and that's when they make their decision to try to kill him.
So in other words, at that point, it's spiraling beyond their control.
Yeah, they don't think they have any other choice. And they're desperate, but remember what motivates these people. The Pharisees want to be loved by everybody for being holy. The Sadducees want power and money. And they both see Christ as threatening them completely. They're going to lose everything they have. And they think that if they just kill him, then they'll be okay.
Okay, so we'll wrap up with this question. And then hopefully you can answer
This lady has a question.
Yes, so this is
okay.
Here. And,
If we don't get to it, I'll stay afterwards and be glad to talk to you.
so he had voice surgery, so he has typed out his question
Oh.
on the laptop, and so I'm going to ask it for him. So the unanimous conviction is presumed to be collusion. Judges may have voted guilty under public pressure and have the opportunity to vote innocent 2 days later. Does Exodus 23 also have relevance? So here's Exodus 23 states.
Thank you, because I don't know what it says.
It says, "You shall not follow a crowd to do evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. You shall not show partiality to a poor man in his dispute." So here's his question. Are Torah laws to be applied by management, teachers, churches, and others with authority?
Today, Torah laws?
Today?
Oh, okay, today? Well, remember, Israel, when at that time was a theocracy ruled by God. This is before the first king, Saul. So they are under the direct control of Saul and of God. In our system, we give religious liberty, and if you are an unbeliever and not Jewish, then that would not be allowed to enforce Torah laws. Now, that's the legal answer to that. Religious liberty, by the way, is our most important liberty, and it's the one that's under greatest attack. Can I just say one thing about that real quickly? We have basically 40 rights in our Bill of Rights, and religious liberty is in our First Amendment. All of the rights, all 40 of them, this is another course I teach, all 40 of them came from the struggle by the Protestant Reformation to have religious liberty to believe what they want to say what they want to say, and to publish. All those rights come out of this religious struggle where it was either the Roman Catholic Church in Central Europe or the Tudor kings that were the head of the Anglican Church in England wanted to control every aspect of worship and every aspect of belief, and if you dared to disagree with them, they put you to death in a terrible way by burning you alive. Now, all of our rights came from that. Now, historically, every right in our Bill of Rights has been given what we call strict scrutiny protection, which is the highest level of protection in our legal system, and that holds that no government can in any way impair that right in any way whatsoever unless it is absolutely necessary to reach a compelling government purpose. So for instance, if there's a ticking hydrogen bomb that's about to kill millions of people, that's a compelling governmental interest. So all of these rights are protected historically and have never been not subject to this protection of strict scrutiny until 1990. And in 1990, there was a Supreme Court case called Employment Division versus Smith that involved a man who was a drug rehab counselor, Native American, up in either Oregon or Washington, Oregon, I think. And he used peyote and got busted and fired from his job, and he filed for unemployment compensation, but the state law would not give him unemployment compensation if he was fired for drug use. So he brings a case that comes to the Supreme Court, and he gets him a lawyer, and the lawyer says, hey, this is your Native American religion, therefore it's protected by the First Amendment. Now, the author of this case, which is the worst case on religious liberty in our entire country's history, happens to be one of my favorite judges, Antonin Scalia. People are shocked to hear that. So what happened? Well, I'm going to have to speculate about the mental process of another here, but Justice Scalia, who I admire, please on the tape, I admire him incredibly, but he's a human being as well, and we all make mistakes. He is a very pious Roman Catholic, very sincere Roman Catholic, and I think that he just did not really think that using peyote was a valid exercise of religion. But unfortunately, the language of his opinion says the government can now come in and violate your religious rights as long as they don't name your group by name in the statute. And so if you're wondering how is it that in Colorado you have the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, or these other cases where people are attacked, and I think he was fined $250,000 for their religious beliefs. The Obama administration filed suit against my university and tried to put us out of business by fining us $13 million a year, every year, because we wouldn't provide abortion care for our female employees because it's against our religious groups. They also wanted to fine, get this, the Little Sisters of the Poor. If I have any Catholic friends in here, if y'all know who they are, it's a group of nuns. Most of them are 60 to 80 years old, and they deal with poor people who are dying to give them a dignified death. That's what they do. Obama wanted, the administration fined them $250 million a year because they wouldn't provide abortion services for 60, 70, 80-year-old Catholic nuns. Well, how did these regulations get through? It was because of the door that was opened with that case, okay? So our current House of Representatives has passed laws that are going to take away more of our religious protections as well. So we're at a crisis where when I talk to Christian groups, I'm not a political activist, okay? But we need to pay attention. We shouldn't just turn our back on what's going on in society because we have the obligation to preserve these rights and liberties for the next generation. And another thing that you should know, generally by 60 to 70%, poll after poll after poll, says that university students in the United States favor repealing the First Amendment. Because that's what their professors are telling them they should think. And the minds at that age are very malleable. That's why I've chosen to teach at that age rather than in law school. In law school, you don't really have time to talk about these things that are of interest. You just have to learn what the law is and get to work. Did that answer the question?
Great.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right.